This crisis is manifesting itself in the perpetuation of gross human rights violations, the selective application of the law, which we're going to discuss in great detail today, and the arbitrary and unconstitutional persecution of citizens for no reason except that the regime is in a clear state of fear. It's in panic mode and has effectively declared war on the people. All of this is a product of disputed elections, and this dispute has caused the breakdown of the social contract between the state and its citizens. Mr. Mnangagwa and his regime are so fearful and unstable that this has created fictional and imaginary enemies out of the people, and the regime's unfounded fear of the citizens has caused it to resort to tactics of oppression and repression. Now, Mr. Mnangagwa's fear finds expression in, number one, the historical pattern of abuse, which we're all now very familiar with, repression and violence. It goes back as far as Bukrabundi, Murambachina, the 2008 election violence, the post-election violence that we saw in 2018, and then the killings that we saw subsequently in 2019, not to mention the episodes of political violence that we've experienced in between. It also finds expression in their attempt to try and decimate the main opposition. They treat us like a banned organization. They went so far as to destroy what was the main opposition as it used to be, the MDC Alliance. They took MPs, they took the HQ, they took political party finances, and yet we came back stronger and built a brand new movement. But still, they continue to come after us. Mr. Mnangagwa was clearly terrified. They ban our meetings. They banned rallies in Chipinge, Mashungo, Gokwe, Marondera, Binga, Glenora, any rally of the CCC that they believe is threatening to their existence, they ban for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Certainly no reason that's cognizable at law. Everybody knows that the right to assemble and gather is protected under Section 58 of the Constitution. But this has been erased completely by the regime's paranoia. They've even criminalized the mere wearing of yellow. We also see expression of Mr. Mnangagwa's fear in the killing of Mazwi Ndlovu. Do you remember that? A killing that took place in Matabeleland South. He complained about the politicization of food aid, and he was followed home by ZANU-PF thugs who assaulted him, and he died subsequently. We also saw the violence of ZANU-PF when President Nelson Chamisa was conducting his rural outreach tour last year. The president's car was shot at, suffered bullet holes, and yet to date there's been no investigation, just complete impunity. The perpetrators were identified and reported to the police, but nothing was done. Mr. Mnangagwa's fear was also shown by the Stone Age episode of violence that we saw in the bloodbath that transpired at our Kwekwe rally prior to the 26th March by-election. Kwekwe was turned into a bloody war zone. It resulted in the unfortunate death of Mboneni Ngube. ZANU-PF was at the center of it. We all recall the police memo that recorded that at least 4 of the members that were arrested subsequently had ZANU-PF cards. Hundreds of our members were badly injured. Mr. Mnangagwa's fear was later shown in the abduction and gruesome murder of Mo Blessing Ali. We're going to talk about that some more. But before we get there, ZANU-PF continues to incite violence. We all remember that a top leader of ZANU-PF said, "We will crush the CCC like lice." This is the context in which we find the Nyatsime violations. We also have the case of a known ZANU-PF leader from Beringwa, Abdul Mashayanyika, who threatened President Nelson Chamisa with death. He still walks free. Formal reports, not one, not two, numerous, have been made to the police and yet no investigation has been committed. He continues with impunity. We all saw, there's evidence again on video, Nyatsime councillors from ZANU-PF incite violence against our members at the funeral of More Blessing Ali. They declared Nyatsime a ZANU-PF zone, notwithstanding that the Constitution guarantees that all citizens can move freely everywhere in the country. Again, absolutely nothing was done. We know the stories of the terror gangs that have been operating in the rural areas, threatening CCC members and doing the bidding of ZANU-PF. It's become so bad that ZANU-PF has become a criminal organization. All of this evidence shows that they harbor criminals who conduct criminal activity with absolutely no sanction or condemnation from their party. It's become so bad that Zimbabwe is experiencing a subtle state of emergency, a night genocide and apartheid in the countryside, where if you're CCC, you don't get seed, you don't get government basic services, you don't get food aid. We've seen a complete politicization and weaponization of food aid. We've seen crawlheads, traditional leaders, commandeered to do the bidding of ZANU-PF, something that is contrary and proscribed to the Constitution. We've seen latent persecution of citizens, especially in rural areas, where it's a choice between being politically active and eating food. This is obviously compounded by the patent persecution that we actually see, including the arrest and unlawful detention of 16 citizens relating to the incidents that took place in Nyatsime. Zimbabwe has experienced the weaponization of politics, abuse of the legal system, and further abuse of the courts to try and silence and undermine political opponents. This is directly contrary to Section 67 of the Constitution, which gives us the right to form political organizations, to gather, and even to challenge ZANU-PF. All of this is conduct from a regime that has no consent to govern from the citizens. And as has been highlighted by various domestic and international actors, Zimbabwe suffers from an intractable problem. A problem that finds expression in the fact that political leaders cannot find each other because ZANU-PF rejects sincere political dialogue and has no will to reform. This takes me to the purpose of today's press briefing. The purpose of this presser is to tell the story of the grave violations, grave human rights abuses that have been committed against citizens in the Nyatsime community. I want to underscore the fact from the get-go that all of the citizens who've been arrested are innocent. They are simply being victimized. Any lawyer knows that the presumption of innocence is guaranteed under our Constitution. This means that every citizen is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And so we reject totally the narrative that honorable members like Job Sikala are responsible for committing crimes. He does not have a single conviction against him. In fact, if you look at most of the Nyatsime arrested victims, they were nowhere near any scenes of political violence. Some of them just happened to be in Nyatsime or traveling to Nyatsime and have been and were captured in what is a clear, unconstitutional, illegal dragnet arrest. The law has, as a result, been selectively applied. Why do we say this? Known ZANU-PF members incited violence at the funeral of More Blessing Ali. Suspected ZANU-PF thugs committed clear acts of violence and arson targeting CCC community leaders. And yet not a single member of ZANU-PF has been brought before the courts to answer to criminal charges of inciting public violence, and arson. It's gotten so bad that ZANU-PF is abusing the police service to target, persecute, and silence CCC members. What the records of these arrests and detentions clearly show is that there's no reasonable suspicion that they've committed any offenses, which is the basic test that's set at law. And so we say that the illegal dragnet is clearly calculated to divert attention from the murder and abduction of Mo Blessing Ali. In fact, the police owe the public an explanation and a clear investigation into her gruesome death. She was later found at the home of a ZANU-PF member. The bail procedure has been weaponized against our members, yet it's a constitutional entitlement. The presumption of innocence, like we've mentioned time and again, has been assaulted. Freedom, democracy, and the rule of law are all on trial. And so all the persecution that we're going to talk about today must be understood in the context of this fraught electoral environment. Now, we've heard the story time and again of the Nyatsime 16. Today we're going to paint a picture of what exactly is it that happened or that they're being charged with. What evidence exists in respect of each of these 16. Now, we all know the story of Honorable Job Sikala, Honorable Godfrey Sithole. They're both members of the CCC and they're honorable members of Parliament. They've been arrested since the 14th of June. Job Sikala is a legal practitioner. He was engaged by the family of Mo Blessing Ali, firstly to do a habeas corpus application, which is an application to try and find her when she was missing so that those who had taken her could present her before the court. We all know that she was abducted around the 24th of May, 2022. That's the time at which she was engaged by the family. After she was found dead, the family then contracted him to be a watching brief to monitor the investigation into the murder and abduction of Mo Blessing Ali. We all know that ZANU-PF has a pattern of hiding evidence, of not bringing those responsible for political murders, abductions, and political violence to account. And so he was engaged to ensure that the investigation was done thoroughly. And this is the reason that he was arrested. And to compound how bad the Job Sikala situation is, he's facing 2 charges arising from exactly the same facts. This is the classic double jeopardy, which is prohibited under our constitution and under our law. He has been repeatedly denied bail. Double jeopardy is in itself an act of persecution. We come to Godfrey Sithole, who was also baselessly charged with inciting public violence and denied bail. His crime is that he led the security team that led to the eventual discovery of Mo Blessing at the well of a ZANU-PF member. Now, both these honorable members of Parliament are being held in deplorable conditions. They're being denied access to consult their legal practitioners in private. They're being tortured and being forced to come to court in leg irons. They're being denied access to their visitors. We all know that President Chamisa led a delegation that went to Chikurubi prison, and for no reason that is recognized at law, he was denied access. They are told that their family can only have 1 visitor a week. All of this is persecution. We know what happens to ZANU-PF MPs when they are caught and released. They come from the gallery and their desire is that his car was seen driving to the Nyatsime area. He never set foot at any funeral, at any gathering. There's no evidence of him committing any acts of violence or speaking about violence. But he was caught up in this illegal dragnet. There's also the case of Robert Madzokere, who is just an ordinary citizen, a social worker, again picked up at random from his home in Nyatsime and charged with public violence. The assault on the citizens is unconstitutional and it has to stop. The next story is about 3 businessmen who again were caught up in this dragnet illegal arrest. It's the story of Zephania Chinembiri, Zek Maponi, and Rowan Tsoka. They run transport businesses. They've never been seen or caught anywhere near any scene of political violence. They've not uttered any incitement to violence. Their only offense, according to the police, is that they own the lorries that transported mourners to Mo Blessing Ali's funeral service. It's the same funeral service where our chain champion-in-chief, Advocate Nelson Chamisa, clearly said that we are not a party of violence. We denounce violence in any form that it's found, but they weren't even there. Yet they've also been charged with public violence under Section 36 of the Criminal Code. They were denied bail on the 27th of June 2022, and their bail appeals again are pending. We then have the story of four lorry drivers who've also been caught in the illegal dragnet arrest. These lorry drivers are Shepherd Bulakisi, Tatenda Pindahama, Ino Soka, and Emmanuel Muradzika. Their sole crime is that they so happened to be driving lorries. Now, anybody knows that the mere act of driving a lorry is not an act of public violence. They were not caught near any scenes of public violence, and yet they were arrested and detained on the 23rd of June on charges of public violence. They were also denied bail on the 28th of June 2022, and their bail appeals are pending. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of the Nyatsime 16. What this clearly does is paint a picture that these citizens are not criminals. They've not committed any offense. They're simply being persecuted by Mr. Mnangagwa's fearful and paranoid regime. The question that then arises is, what has the CCC done? Now, we continue to stand in solidarity with these 16 victims of political violence, abuse, and persecution. There's no place for such conduct by the state in a constitutional democracy. And to assist the families, we've mobilized legal representation for each of the 16 victims. In fact, we've beefed up that team to include top lawyers and advocates to ensure that no stone is left unturned legally, and they get the best legal representation any citizen can get to facilitate and expedite their right to liberty. We've also mobilized welfare for the families. In fact, if you look at the stories of the families, again, they tell a very sad story. One of the wives of one of these victims, I don't need to mention by name, gave birth, and that child was born while their dad was in prison, unconstitutionally, unlawfully. One of these victims, one of the Nyatsime 16, has a chronically ill child who requires special medical treatment. This medical treatment is costly. Now that he's been in jail since the middle of June, they've been unable to give health relief to this poor child. That is the effect and extent of the abuse of ZANU-PF and the consequence of this illegal conduct. Now, we've also written to regional bodies, including SADC and the AU. We've lobbied heads of state. We all know that the SADC summit is currently taking place in the DRC, to draw attention to the depth of the Zimbabwean crisis, and spotlighted in particular the urgent need to release the Nyatsime 16. This takes me to the last issue. What needs to be done? The first and most important thing is that all 16 of the Nyatsime 16 members must be granted bail, because bail is a constitutional right and it's a human right. There's a need for all state institutions to ensure that they uphold the presumption of innocence, which is guaranteed under our Constitution. We also call for an end to the arbitrary and targeted arrests of our members and citizens in general. The mere act of driving a lorry is not an act of public violence. They were not caught near any scenes of public violence, and yet they were arrested and detained on the 23rd of June on charges of public violence. They were also denied bail on the 28th of June 2022, and their bail appeals are pending. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of the Nyatsime 16. What this clearly does is paint a picture that these citizens are not criminals. They've not committed any offense. They're simply being persecuted by Mr. Mnangagwa's fearful and paranoid regime. The question that then arises is, what has the CCC done? Now, we continue to stand in solidarity with these 16 victims of political violence, abuse, and persecution. There's no place for such conduct by the state in a constitutional democracy. And to assist the families, we've mobilized legal representation for each of the 16 victims. In fact, we've beefed up that team to include top lawyers and advocates to ensure that no stone is left unturned legally, and they get the best legal representation any citizen can get to facilitate and expedite their right to liberty. We've also mobilized welfare for the families. In fact, if you look at the stories of the families, again, they tell a very sad story. One of the wives of one of these victims, I don't need to mention by name, gave birth, and that child was born while their dad was in prison, unconstitutionally, unlawfully. One of these victims, one of the Nyatsime 16, has a chronically ill child who requires special medical treatment. This medical treatment is costly. Now that he's been in jail since the middle of June, they've been unable to give health relief to this poor child. That is the effect and extent of the abuse of ZANU-PF and the consequence of this illegal conduct. Now, we've also written to regional bodies, including SADC and the AU. We've lobbied heads of state. We all know that the SADC summit is currently taking place in the DRC, to draw attention to the depth of the Zimbabwean crisis, and spotlighted in particular the urgent need to release the Nyatsime 16. This takes me to the last issue. What needs to be done? The first and most important thing is that all 16 of the Nyatsime 16 members must be granted bail, because bail is a constitutional right and it's a human right. There's a need for all state institutions to ensure that they uphold the presumption of innocence, which is guaranteed under our Constitution. We also call for an end to the arbitrary and targeted arrests of our members and citizens in general. The law requires that before you arrest someone, there has to be a reasonable suspicion that they've committed an offense. The fact that you sometimes wear yellow doesn't form a reasonable suspicion that you've committed an act of public violence. The fact that you're a lorry driver, the fact that your home was burnt, the fact that you own a lorry business, none of this meets the threshold of law that allows the police and state institutions to deny a citizen liberty. And so to this end, we call for an end to ZANU-PF's abuse of state institutions, including the police. We call for a complete end to all forms of political violence, especially incitement to violence, something that ZANU-PF is well known for. We call for those who are responsible for inciting public violence, especially members of ZANU-PF, to be brought to book. We call for a thorough, independent investigation into the circumstances of the murder and abduction of Mo Blessing Ali. The person who is responsible for her death must be convicted appropriately in a court of law. We also call for improvement of prison conditions. We cannot be worse than the Rhodesian regime in how we treat those who are detained. They, like any Zimbabwean citizen, have the right to dignity. And yet we've seen visitors being banned. We're stopped from visiting our members. They also come to court in leg chains. They're held in deplorable conditions, overcrowding, and poor sanitation. We additionally call for urgent political dialogue to resolve the governance and political crisis that Zimbabwe faces. We appeal to the citizens to stand in solidarity with the members of the Nyatsime 16 and their families. Civic society must play their role. The church must play its role. We must continue to pray for peace in Zimbabwe. Citizens must remain peaceful. The international community must play its role. I've already indicated that we are lobbying, and we've lobbied SADC. They're seized with the Zimbabwean matter. Because if this crisis is allowed to continue, there's a real risk and possibility that regional peace and security will be undermined. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, they thought they'd finished us, but we've come back stronger. The CCC continues to mobilize citizens to act for change in 2023. We continue to implore all citizens to register to vote in their millions. We call upon the young, the old. Every single citizen has responsibility to ensure that we play our part to win Zimbabwe for change, so that we ultimately see an end to all these abuses. They've given us a fresh platform, and we'll leave no stone unturned in the quest to win Zimbabwe for change. Thank you. We've made no secret. In fact, since 2018, we've been consistent that in order to solve the Zimbabwean crisis, there's need for urgent, sincere political dialogue between the main actors. And I'm not talking about something like POLAD, which is an attempt to obfuscate the real issues or cloud the real issues with fake conversations. Real political dialogue that's centered especially around reform. Lovejoy, at the start I said that the crisis is a product of the fact that Zimbabwe continues to face disputed elections. There's urgent need for dialogue around the electoral reform agenda. We've made 7 basic asks. The first is that the right to vote must be fully facilitated. The second is that there should be a credible voter's roll. The third is that there should be a credible results, a transmission and management system. The fourth is that there should be security of the vote and the voter. And the fifth is the voter. The sixth is that there's urgent need to ensure that there's integrity around ZEC, its personnel, its processes, and polling material. And then finally, something that we talked about in detail today, there's a need for there to be reforms that allow for political freedoms to be actualized, including media freedom and access to all political parties to the media. So that's what dialogue, that is the dialogue agenda that we've put forward as the CCC, and it's urgent. Anything else, we're not interested in cars, we're not interested in positions, we're not interested in staying in fancy hotels. We just want those 7 electoral pillars to be addressed, and to be addressed urgently, so that post-2023, we don't find ourselves in the same vicious cycle of disputed elections. The Zimbabwean crisis has been slow burning for a very long time. It's now time to bring it to an end.
Thank you. My name is Willie Matimba. I'm a freelance reporter. What is your explanation to the intention by Mr. Jobsikana to bring in foreign legal representatives? This is, in fact, like in CCC, it's more like we have so many capable lawyers who can actually handle the case. But then we find Mr. Tsikala trying to bring in foreign legal representatives. Is it not a sign that he has actually lost faith in his electoral colleagues?
Well, that's obviously not correct, and it's important to set the record straight about Honourable Jobsikala's legal representation. At no point has a foreign lawyer come in because there isn't an adequate Zimbabwean lawyer. In fact, currently, his legal team is the best in the business in this jurisdiction and possibly regionally. He's represented by a very strong legal team in which we and Mr. Sikala himself have total and full confidence. His international lawyer was engaged to ensure that they do some international lobbying on his behalf. We've already spoken about the fact that the Zimbabwean crisis has now been internationalized, and he's lobbying on that front. But it was never the case that we're going to call a foreign lawyer to come and do a basic bail application that any first-year law student can do. The problem is not his legal representation. The problem is the system of injustice, the system that doesn't give due fulfillment and respect to the constitutional right to bail. And anyone who's practiced law in this jurisdiction knows that even a self-actor can apply for bail. So the problem with Honourable Jobsikala, Honourable Godfrey Sithole, and the rest of the Nyatsime group is not that their legal representation is bad. The problem is that the system is stacked against them. And there clearly have been instructions from ZANU-PF that they must be persecuted and a political message must be sent to them. This has got nothing to do with the law and everything to do with politics. And we know that it's got to do with politics because when ZANU-PF commits crimes that are recorded on video, they're never arrested. If it was just simply about upholding the rule of law, if someone says the CCC must be crushed like lice, that person would be arrested and brought before a court of law. If a ZANU-PF member in Berengwa holds a rural meeting and says President Chamisa should be killed, that person should be arrested and brought before a court of law. That's incitement to violence. It doesn't get stronger than that. When someone murders, abducts Mo Blessing Ali, before the citizens find that body, the police investigation should be on top of it. That's what we call the rule of law. When Boneni Ngube is killed, it shouldn't take between March and August before anything is done to prosecute and convict those responsible, especially when they're known. That's what would have been called the rule of law, but clearly this case has got nothing to do with law, everything to do with politics, everything to do with the attempt to persecute and silence political opponents contrary to all provisions of the Constitution, the rule of law, and basic tenets of constitutional democracy. Nobody has got the right to take that right away. It's a constitutional imperative. The law says constitutionally that citizens must vote, and that's exactly what citizens will do.
Yeah, sure.
Masha Obwanya, Zimlife. Some political analysts have actually speculated that ahead of the 2023 elections, political persecution of political activists is only going to intensify. They've also said that in the run-up for the 2023 elections, there are not going to be any electoral reforms, not diaspora vote, and definitely ZEP will not be disbanded. So given these circumstances, what guarantees does CC give to their supporters?
So the CCC has been participating in elections since the CCC was born. I mean, we are about 7 months old, and we've participated in elections, and we've won at least 75% of those elections, and we've done so despite the odds. And that tells a very important story. If the CCC is to go to a free and fair election, it will win hands down. In fact, this is confirmed by the data presented in the Afrobarometer report. So what we insist on, and what every citizen's call to action is that the electoral playing field has to be leveled. We cannot sponsor a doom narrative that says reforms mustn't be done. These reforms aren't a luxury. They're not something that you've got the option to do or not. They have a constitutional obligation to act in a particular way. So ZEC simply does not have the power to say, I don't feel like being transparent. I don't feel like acting in a manner that is independent. I don't feel like acting in a manner that delivers an election that's verifiable. I don't feel like being transparent about polling material and polling processes. They have the obligation, and we're going to leave no stone unturned, together with our mass movement of citizens, to ensure that that is done, so that the election in 2023 is not disputed.
Okay, let's take Guru and then Lashtra.
Thank you so much. The demands that you make, Pazi, you've been making these demands over and over again. The right to bail, we heard that before. Weaponization of the law to attack the opposition or those that are from the other side. We've heard that before. We have heard all these demands in our process. Any new strategies that we have as a party to deal with these, problems?
Well, obviously, two things. The first is that strategy is not debated here, but I think our conduct speaks for itself, and I'm going to come to it in a second. About the right to bail, about the absence of political persecution, and so on. Those are things that the CCC demands. These are constitutionally guaranteed rights that every citizen is entitled to. The Constitution says every citizen, every accused person is entitled to bail. The Constitution says that every person is guaranteed the right to personal security, protection of the law, dignity. These aren't things that the CCC is making up. These are things that the Constitution, which is the product of a widespread citizen referendum, guarantees. And so there's no option. You don't, as ZANU-PF, get to decide, to choose whether or not you comply with the Constitution. You have an obligation to comply. And every citizen, additionally, has the obligation to insist upon compliance with that Constitution. And Section 44 also says that all state institutions or state agencies are bound by those rights that are contained in the Constitution. So it's not negotiable. It's not something that we can give ZANU-PF the leeway to decide, can we say we'll crush CCC like lice? Can we ban their rallies? That's something that should never be allowed. And to show that the CCC strategies have been effective, you've seen that the CCC, notwithstanding all of ZANU-PF's fear-driven tactics to try and distort the vote, we continue to win. That betrays a successful strategy. I don't have to go into it, but we continue to fill stadiums. We don't give people bars of soap, we don't give them $20, we don't give them loaves of bread, we don't even give them regalia. People walk kilometers and kilometers just to hear hope. And so we should never minimize the desire of the citizen for change, the desire of the citizen to participate towards change. People come despite the odds, and that is the strategy. That shows you that the strategy is clearly working, even in rural areas. Look at the victory we experienced in Chipinge recently. Look at the victory in Bingen. The same strategy is being replicated throughout the country. We've got a mass mobilization program that ZANU-PF is fully aware of, that they're fully afraid of, that they're trying to counter, and we're going to continue. No strategy beats putting citizens at the center of every single decision and activity and program of action that you do. And that is the essence or the philosophy that drives all our activities and all our strategies.
Thank you, Lavshay.
I forget. It's been, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's been 3 months since Honorable Stolle and Honorable Sikala and the Nyatsime gang have been arrested. And in the streets, so to speak, there's belief that the party is letting them down. They are saying that some members who have been arrested before, CCC or MDC Alliance as it was back then, you have taken to the streets to demand justice for them, but there hasn't been much done in regards to the 16 that have been arrested. So what is the CCC plan for these guys should the courts not grant bail to the gang?
So it's important to state and to set the record straight again, Lovejoy, that Honorable Job Sikala, Honorable Godfrey Sitole, and all the Nyatsime group that constitute the Nyatsime 16 have not been let down by the CCC. They've been let down by the system. The system is meant to guarantee them certain rights. Those rights aren't guaranteed or given by the CCC. It's not the CCC that says that every citizen, every accused person has the right to bail. It's the Constitution that says that. And to the extent that a police service or a state institution fails to comply with that constitutional obligation, they have failed. And I can tell you, even if I were to run up and down the streets, even if I were to, as they do in certain countries in Africa, do all manner of demonstration, that is not what releases a citizen. We all know the institution that's got the obligation to release a citizen and grant them bail. And so our programs of action are never going to be prescribed by the enemy, by our opponents. They're not going to tell us what to do. We know that a lot of these political persecutions are scripted, and we've got a plan. Not limited to all the things that I've said, but we continue to lobby the international community. SADC, as it's sitting right now, is seized with the Zimbabwean crisis. And so we're being very strategic. I've already told you about the electoral playing field that the CCC finds itself in, where we can't even have a meeting to say Shandukom Zimbabwe. That is unconstitutional. That is unconstitutional. Just tweeting in the comfort of my home before I've even gone to demonstrate, you get arrested and sent to Chikurubi for 10 days. That's the environment. And so we have to change the narrative. It's important to point to where the problem lies. The problem is not that we're not demonstrating. The problem is that there's a shrinking democratic space where the Constitution has been assaulted, where citizens' rights are being erased totally, and this does not bode well for a free and fair election in 2023, which is our basic minimum demand as we progress to that landmark election.
Okay, I think that's the last question.
Hi, Fazali. My name is Hilary. In terms of voter mobilization, you find most of the youth are not registered, and they're not willing to register because of unfair elections and stuff like that. What's your take on that? What's the strategy to mobilize youth so that they register to vote?
Now, the narrative that young people don't want to vote again is a myth. We've gone onto the ground, and in fact, when we mobilize young people to register, they're extremely keen. But the first thing they say is, I don't have an ID card. I cannot register to vote because when I go to ZEC's offices, they say there's no electricity, they say their machines are not working. And so if anything, we know that constitutionally the mandate to mobilize citizens to register rests with ZEC. ZEC is not doing enough if you look at the figures. The status, the census data versus the voter registration data, they have the obligation. So they've done something that's completely wrong. And we know about the voter suppression strategy where they don't want young people to register to vote. Don't blame them at 2000, they're ready. Just make sure their ID cards are there. Make sure that you've got an accessible voter registration center. You can't say to a young person who lives in Budiriro, who's not employed, come to Cecil House here and register to vote. It simply doesn't work. So we can clearly see that there's a deliberate strategy on the part of ZEC to try and suppress the vote. And that's why we're saying those sort of things must be addressed urgently. Even when they did the blitz, they wouldn't even put a sign. You'd have to drive all around the University of Zimbabwe, for example. They bury the registration center where no one can see it because they don't want people to register to vote. Have you heard of any campaigns on radio, on ZBC saying register to vote? Even if you look at the so-called heads of state, people who say that they're in charge of the country, have you ever heard them calling for voter registration? They aren't. It's a clear strategy by the system and the institutions that need reform that citizens shouldn't register to vote. So don't blame the young people. The young people are ready. They're mobilized. Even when we mobilize our citizens, they'll be there, they'll be ready. Then you say, even here at Cecil House, no, ZEC is refurbishing the office. How can you refurbish during time that people are supposed to register? How can you say that your machines aren't working? How can you say that there's no electricity? How can you locate a registration center? Imagine being a young person in Nyatsime. You think they don't want to come and register to vote here at Cecil House? There are clear obstacles in the way that stop them, and that's what should be addressed, and that's why that's part of our reform agenda and our basic minimum demands for a free and fair election in 2023.